Part 1. The Noise. The world had known about vampires for just over a century. Not the cape and coffin variety, but the real ones, the empaths, the emotional feeders, the old families who had lived alongside humanity since before humanity had cities. The Covenant of Mutual Residence, ratified in 1947, laid out the terms. Vampires could feed on ambient emotional energy without restriction, but targeted feeding, deliberately provoking someone's emotions for consumption, was a criminal act. Turning required documented consent. Courts governed their own and submitted to periodic review by the Joint Commission on Interspecies Affairs, a body so tediously bureaucratic that it had, against all odds, managed to keep the peace for decades, largely because no one on either side could stay awake long enough during its proceedings to start a war. In practice, it was messier. There were vampires who targeted. There were humans who hunted. The enforcement was underfunded and perpetually behind reality. But the framework held. Humans and vampires shared cities the way any neighbors did, with rules, resentment, and the pragmatic understanding that war was worse. It was within this world that Calum stood at the tall, unglazed window of his study and wished, not for the first time, that he could simply stop hearing. Below, the metropolis sprawled, a grid of light and shadow, each pinprick a soul broadcasting its state of being into the ether. For his kind, for the empaths of the House of Calum, this was the hunting ground, the pasture, the air they breathed. For him, it was simply noise. Grief from a hospital 2 blocks east tasted of rust and cold iron, a heavy, scraping meal. A flare of joy from a rooftop party, a proposal maybe, was a sudden, cloying burst of honey and cheap champagne that did nothing to cut the bitterness. The dominant flavor, as always, was anxiety. A thin, acidic broth, the taste of ozone and bile. A million low-grade worries about rent and love and the future, simmering into a citywide miasma. He fed on it, his body metabolizing the raw energy into sustenance. But the diet was killing his soul. He had once described the experience to Alistair as eating at a buffet where every dish is someone's worst day. Alistair had suggested meditation. Calum had suggested Alistair try jumping off the roof. They had not discussed it again. For 300 years, he had been the leader of his court, and for 300 years, he had been the nexus for all their feelings. He could feel Kalen's centuries-old melancholy seeping through the floorboards from the library below. Dust and dried roses. Ilara's simmering resentment toward her long-dead sire was a sharp, metallic tang from across the hall. It was a house of ghosts, and he was the only one who could see them all. The weight of it was immense. Being a leader meant being a buffer, a dam against the tide of your people's pain. But the dam was cracking. The hunger was a physical thing, a tightening in his throat, a hollowness behind his ribs that demanded to be filled. He could gorge himself on the frantic energy of a nearby nightclub, but the thought was exhausting, like trying to quench a thirst by drinking from a fire hose. A polite, unnaturally steady knock sounded at the door. Alistair, his seneschal, his oldest friend, and the only being in the house who could project disapproval so refined it tasted like single malt scotch. "She is here," Alistair said, his voice a low baritone. His own emotional signature was a comfort, a smooth, aged flavor like old leather and cedar, a loyalty so deep it had become part of Calum's own landscape. Send her in. He had resisted this, a mental health initiative. They were vampires. Their baggage had baggage. What could a human, a creature of fleeting passions and a lifespan shorter than a single one of Calum's grudges, possibly offer? But the younger members of the court had been insistent, and Calum, feeling his own control erode, had agreed. He had drawn the line at group trust falls. The door opened, and the world went quiet. It wasn't silence. He could hear the scuff of her shoes on the antique rug, the whisper of fabric as she moved. He could hear her heart, a clean, steady drum unburdened by the chaotic static of feeling. But the symphony of the city, the oppressive chorus of his own court, it was as if a wall of thick, soundproof glass had been erected between him and all of it. He could see the storm raging, but he could no longer feel the wind or the rain. The relief was so profound it buckled his knees. He gripped the back of a leather wingback, knuckles white. His senses, which for his entire existence had been turned outward, flooded with the feelings of others, suddenly had nowhere to go. They hit the placid surface of her presence and stopped. For the first time in his memory, he was alone inside his own head. The resulting quiet was vast, terrifying, and the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. She stepped fully into the room, average height, dressed in the simple, severe lines of professional attire, dark hair pulled back, face composed, a leather satchel. Nothing remarkable about her, and yet she was the most remarkable thing to ever enter his home. "Mr. Calum, I'm Willa Abernathy. Thank you for seeing me." He stared. He was trying to get a read, a taste, anything. It was as involuntary as breathing. He looked at people and he knew them, their hopes, their fears, the specific ache of their oldest wound. With her, there was nothing. Not emptiness, not repression where he could taste feelings being shoved down, just silence. He had heard of it in the old texts, a vanishingly rare neurological variation. The old term was still-souled. The modern literature called it affective signal attenuation, fewer than 100 documented cases worldwide. Her feelings were real, fully felt, but they stayed inside. She was, to his senses, a perfectly sealed room. It was, he thought, profoundly unfair that such a person had chosen a career in therapy, where her natural gift was indistinguishable from professional excellence. "You're punctual," he managed. 300 years of eloquence, and his opening line to the most extraordinary human he had ever met was a comment about time management. A small, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Or perhaps it did. He had no way of knowing. "I find it helps to be. Shall we?" They sat. She opened a tablet, movements efficient. Her language was corporate, mundane, ludicrously inadequate for describing a coven of ancient predators wrestling with immortality. But the absurdity was a lifeline. It was normal. She was normal. And her normality was a shield. "The conflicts are generational," he said. "The world changes, some of us do not. Especially in family-run businesses with deeply entrenched hierarchies. Something like that. Though our onboarding process is somewhat more permanent than most. I noticed the turnover rate was essentially 0, she said without looking up. That's either extraordinary culture or extraordinary coercion." He found himself leaning forward just slightly, trying to get closer to the quiet. The hunger was still there, the hollow ache in his chest, but it was a distant thing now, a noise on the other side of a very thick door. He could think. He could focus on the grain of the wood on the table beside him, the scent of old paper and beeswax in the room, the specific, individual sound of her heartbeat. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. A perfect, simple metronome in the glorious silence. She looked up, and her gaze was direct. Not challenging, just observant. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, but a microscope that could only see the surface. It was a novel sensation. He was barely listening to her questions about organizational dynamics. He was watching the way the low lamplight caught the line of her jaw, the slight furrow between her brows as she concentrated. He was addicted. Less than 10 minutes, and he was hopelessly addicted to this nothingness. He needed more. He needed her to move in. He needed her to never leave. He was behaving exactly like the kind of client she probably had a protocol for. "What are your terms?" he asked, abrupt. "My hourly rate, a 6-month contract, weekly sessions with you, Bi-weekly group sessions. Agreed. You haven't heard the rate. It's irrelevant. He would give her the house. He was negotiating with the desperation of an addict, and the rational part of his mind was screaming at him to slow down. He did not slow down. She began to pack her things. A spike of panic. She was leaving. The wall was coming down. Wait! More plea than command. My people can be resistant. How will you earn their trust? The real question was, how can I make you stay? Trust isn't demanded, Mr. Calum. It's built. Through consistency, confidentiality, and by demonstrating that I am there to help, not to judge. I don't need to know their secrets. I just need to teach them how to carry them. She closed her satchel. The click of the latch was a death knell. She stood. He stood with her, a reflexive gesture of courtesy that felt archaic and stiff. She held out a hand. He looked at it. A human hand. Warm. Alive. He reached out and took it, his own cold fingers closing around hers. The temperature difference was stark, a reminder of the chasm between them. But the most shocking thing was the contact itself. No jolt of energy, no sudden insight, just skin on skin. The texture of her palm, the pressure of her grip. A purely physical interaction. It was the most empty and the most full thing he had ever felt. She withdrew her hand, gave a slight nod, and turned. He watched her walk to the door, every step taking the silence with her. Alistair opened it from the outside, and she was gone. The noise came back like a physical blow, the city, the court, his own renewed hunger. He stumbled, pressing hands to his temples. He had tasted peace, and the memory of it was a new, exquisite form of torture. Alistair stepped inside. The contract is prepared. A pause. You look unwell. More unwell than usual, which is saying something for a man who has looked vaguely consumptive since the actual age of consumption. She's remarkable, Calum said quietly. She has a firm handshake, and she didn't flinch when Kaelin walked past reciting Shelley at the ceiling. I consider both encouraging signs. Willa sat in her car, engine off, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had known, of course. Since the Covenant, an entire ecosystem of human professionals had grown up around vampire care. Lawyers, doctors, therapists. But for empath courts, ordinary therapists were useless. You couldn't treat a client who could taste your every feeling before you opened your mouth. The referral had come through a smaller, older channel, one for people with her particular neurological profile. Her condition. Diagnosed at 23, affective signal attenuation. Her emotional processing was entirely internal. She felt everything deeply and fully, but her body didn't broadcast. No micro-expressions tied to unconscious leakage, no autonomic tells. Her feelings stayed inside, like a radio playing in a soundproofed room. It had made her childhood confusing. Her mother had worried she was a sociopath. Her first boyfriend had accused her of not caring. She had learned over time to manually produce the smiles and frowns her body didn't generate automatically. Exhausting. But the cost of moving through a world that expected feelings to be visible. For therapy, it was a superpower. She could sit in the blast radius of someone's worst moment and remain stable. Not because she didn't feel it, but because her body didn't amplify it. The referral network had sent her unusual clients over the years. She didn't ask too many questions about the taxonomy. She just did her job. She started the car, the sudden roar of the engine and the burst of the heater feeling aggressively modern, aggressively alive. She pulled away from the curb, glancing in her rearview mirror at the dark stone facade. Her own emotional state was, as always, a neatly organized room. In one corner, professional curiosity. In another, a healthy, rational awareness of risk. In the center, a quiet hum of focus. She felt the slight tremor in her hand that had started after she'd shaken his, and she observed it, labeled it. Physiological reaction to anomalous stimulus, and filed it away. His hand had been cold. Not cool from the night air cold, a deep, cellular coldness, the kind that seemed to pull warmth from you. It was the only thing about him that had felt overtly non-human. That and the way he had looked at her. Like a starving man who had just been shown a photograph of food and was trying to eat the paper. She knew what she was to him. A null signal, a pocket of dead air. She could imagine the relief, the same way she could imagine the relief of sudden silence for someone who had lived their whole life next to a construction site. She understood the dynamic, and she understood the risk, that he would confuse relief with attachment, quiet with intimacy, the absence of noise with the presence of love. It was, she reflected, going to be a very interesting 6 months. At home, her cat Freud greeted her with a demanding meow. She picked him up, his solid warmth a comforting anchor to the normal world. "Well, Freud, I've taken on a 400-year-old empath vampire as a client. He agreed to my rate without hearing it, which either means he's desperate or very bad with money. Given the cathedral he lives in, I'm going with desperate." Freud purred, a rumbling engine of uncomplicated contentment. He looked at me like I was water in the desert. My first job is making sure he doesn't confuse what I am with who I am. She filed that thought away in a box marked Boundaries, handle with extreme care, possibly fireproof the box. Part 2. The Sessions. Tuesday arrived like a judgment. For Calum, the days leading up to it had been a new kind of hell. The memory of the silence was a constant ache. The usual chaos of his court's emotions felt sharper, more abrasive. Kalen's mournful poetry readings were psychic nails on a chalkboard. Ilara's perpetual anger was a grinding migraine. He found himself retreating to the deepest, most insulated parts of the house, but he couldn't escape his own senses. He was the instrument, and the world would not stop playing him. In a moment of particular desperation, Calum had tried noise-canceling headphones. They did nothing, of course. Emotional noise didn't travel through the ear canal, but the look on Alistair's face when he'd found the leader of the House of Calum sitting in a dark room, wearing Bose headphones and scowling, had been its own small mercy of comedy. "I will pretend I did not see that," Alistair had said, and backed slowly out of the room. When she walked in at 9, the quiet descended. He let out a breath he had been holding for 5 days. "So," she began, tablet at the ready, "in your own words, what is the problem you want to solve?" He went with the practical answer over the honest one, which was that he wanted her to never leave. "My people are drowning in the past. They carry their losses like cloaks, and they've had centuries to accumulate them. The world outside makes their hunger unpredictable." She asked him to define hunger. He explained, emotion as sustenance, strong feelings as rich, addictive meals. She summarized it as an impulse control issue tied to emotional dysregulation. She said it the way someone might say, "Your fridge is leaking." Then she turned the question on him. "And you? Do you struggle?" "I am their leader. I must maintain control." "That's not what I asked." He looked away, his gaze falling on the cold hearth. In the silence, her silence, perhaps he could speak a sliver of truth. "The hunger is constant. I struggle with the relentless noise, with being the repository for every joy and sorrow within these walls. Sometimes, I wish I could feel nothing at all." She wasn't typing, just watching him. The old Calum would have known what she was thinking. He would have tasted her pity, or her clinical assessment. The new Calum knew nothing. He was simply a man who had confessed a weakness to a woman, waiting for her response. The vulnerability of it was excruciating. "It sounds," she said finally, her voice soft, "incredibly lonely." The words hit harder than any torrent of emotion ever had, not because they were potent, but because they were hers, a thought formulated in the quiet of her own mind and chosen to share with him. It wasn't pity he tasted. It wasn't a feeling at all. It was an observation, an act of empathy offered through intellect, not through sensory osmosis. She understood him not because she could feel what he felt, but because she had listened to what he said and thought about what it meant. "It is," he admitted, and the two words cost him more than he would have thought possible. She made a note on her tablet. The professional distance was back, a subtle shift in her posture. Isolation at the leadership level is a significant destabilizer. If you're isolated, you can't effectively support your team. So our work will be twofold: regulation strategies for your court and support systems for you. "I don't need support," he said immediately, the reflexive denial of a man who had been self-sufficient for half a millennium. "Everyone needs support, Calum." She used his name, and it landed differently without the Mr., more personal. Even people who have been in business for a very long time. "I have been in business since before the concept of business existed." "Then you're overdue." He found himself wanting to know about her. It was a sharp, unfamiliar curiosity, entirely separate from his hunger. It wasn't about consuming her feelings. It was about discovering her thoughts. "And you, Willa? Who supports you?" "I have my own systems, a supervisor I consult with, friends, a cat who is an excellent listener." She delivered the line with a completely straight face. "My support network is robust. We're here to talk about yours." The deflection was so smooth he could only admire it. She was a fortress, and he was standing at the gates asking to be let in, while she was trying to hand him a blueprint to repair his own crumbling walls. He spent the rest of the hour answering her questions, feeling strangely like he was in a confessional. He spoke of Kaelin, turned in the midst of the Romantic era and forever trapped in its maudlin sensibilities. He has been writing the same elegy for 200 years. It doesn't even rhyme. He spoke of Aurora, whose rage was the only thing that made her feel alive. He spoke of the younger ones, turned in an age of digital overstimulation, who struggled to find a quiet place in their own minds. He did not realize until the hour was almost over that he had told her more about the true state of his court than he had ever admitted even to Alastair. When her tablet chimed, signaling the end of the session, the now familiar dread washed over him. She packed her bag. The silence was already thinning, the distant roar of the city's emotions growing louder in his mind. "Next week," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'll be here." She paused at the door. "Thank you for your candor, Calum. It's not always easy for leaders to be that open." He just nodded, unable to speak. He needed to hold on to the quiet for a few more seconds. She left. The door closed. The storm crashed back in. But this time, something was different. Underneath the cacophony, a single, clear note remained. Her voice, saying, "It sounds incredibly lonely." It wasn't a feeling he could feed on. It was a memory. And for the first time, he found a sliver of sustenance in that. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get him through the night. The first group session was a controlled disaster. 5 vampires around a mahogany table, their collective age over a millennium. Willa stood at the head with a whiteboard she had brought with her. She had faced worse rooms. Once, she'd facilitated conflict resolution between rival biker gangs in a church basement. This was roughly similar, except everyone was immortal and the refreshments were conspicuously absent. Her client list was a study in contrasts. Kaelin, with his wild hair and poet's shirt, looked like he'd just stepped out of a Byron painting. He radiated a sadness so profound it was almost performative. Across from him, Ilara, sharp and severe in modern tailored clothing, projected an aura of pure, jagged anger. Then the younger ones, Liam and Zara, turned in the last 50 years, who vibrated with nervous, restless energy, their eyes constantly flicking to their phones as if expecting a notification from a world they could no longer fully inhabit. And finally, Alastair, who sat beside the empty chair reserved for Calum with the air of a man who had seen every possible kind of nonsense and was simply waiting to see which variety would present itself today. Calum was not present, Willa had insisted, His presence would change the dynamic. His court would not speak freely in front of him. "You're human," Aurora said. "What could you possibly know about our stressors?" "You're right, I don't. The feelings are yours. The tools are universal." "Can a tool mend a heart broken for 217 years? Kalen murmured, his voice a dramatic baritone. 217, Aurora muttered. He's been counting. Of course he's been counting. 217 years, 4 months, and 11 days, Kalen corrected with immense dignity. "No," Willa said, "but it can help you build a new container to hold the pieces, so they don't cut you every time you move." Liam fidgeted, his leg bouncing, the anxiety coming off him a high-frequency buzz. "It's the noise. I can't turn it off. Everyone, all the time." Zara looked up from her phone. "I miss just being bored." A pause. "Also, I miss garlic bread. That's not related, I just wanted to say it out loud." When Willa tried a grounding exercise, Aurora and Kalen weaponized it immediately. "What I can taste is your cloying self-pity, poet. And I yours, harpy, a rage as tedious as it is unending." "Oh good," Alistair murmured. "We've reached the name-calling portion. That usually takes at least 20 minutes. The temperature in the room dropped. The air crackled with their mutual hatred. "Okay," Willa said, her voice cutting through the tension. She didn't raise it, but it had a quality of quiet authority that made them both pause. "Let's reframe. Aurora, Kalen is not a thing you can taste. His emotional state is an external stimulus, like a loud noise or a bright light. Your reaction to it, the anger, is yours. Let's focus on that. Feel the chair under you," she instructed. "The fabric of your clothes against your skin. The coolness of the air. These things are your reality. His feelings are his. You are separate." Alistair, who had been largely silent, spoke. "She is right. We have forgotten. We have become porous." "We were born porous," Aurora snapped. "That's the whole point." "The point," Willa said evenly, "is that porosity without choice is just flooding. I'm not asking you to stop feeling. I'm asking you to choose what you do with what you feel." It was a revolutionary concept. For them, the lines were perpetually blurred. They lived in a soup of shared emotion. The idea of a firm boundary, a self that was distinct from the feelings of others, was utterly foreign. From the doorway, Calum watched, hidden in the shadows. He had told Willa he wouldn't attend. He was, he reflected, turning into the kind of person who lurked in doorways. 400 years, and it had come to this. He watched her navigate their ancient pathologies with her calm, sensible toolkit. She didn't try to solve Kalen's grief. She gave him a technique for containing it. She didn't try to placate Alara's rage. She gave her a language for owning it. He felt a surge of something he couldn't name. Not just admiration. Hope. A terrifying, fragile thing. He had brought this woman here for his own selfish reasons, but she was actually helping. She was healing his court. Later, long after the others had dispersed, he found her in the library alone, wiping down her whiteboard. "They didn't eat you alive," he observed, stepping out of the shadows. She didn't startle. He was beginning to suspect she was impossible to startle. It was a productive first session. They have centuries of unexpressed feelings. It's going to be messy for a while. Messy is our natural state. "You're a good liar," she said, her voice conversational as she capped a marker. He froze. "I beg your pardon?" "You told me you wouldn't attend the session. You were in the hall for 45 minutes. Your shadow is quite distinct. Also, you breathe very loudly for someone who doesn't need to breathe." He was caught. It was a strange feeling. No one had caught him at anything in a very long time. I was curious. Or you don't trust me. No, he said, and the word was instantly, absolutely true. I trust you. I just needed to see it. The work is for them, Calum, and for you. It's not a performance for you to observe. The rebuke was gentle but clear. Another boundary, neatly drawn. He found himself standing very close to her, close enough to see the faint lines around her eyes, to feel the ghost of warmth radiating from her skin. He had an overwhelming urge to reach out, to touch the smudge of marker on her cheek. He resisted. It was the hardest thing he had done all night. I apologize, he said, and he meant it. It won't happen again. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a single, sharp nod. Good. A clear dismissal. He was being managed, handled, like one of her volatile clients. It should have been insulting. Instead, he found it reassuring. She was consistent. She was the calm at the center of his storm, and her rules were the only things holding the storm at bay. He retreated, and as he passed the library, heard Alistair's voice, low and measured, apparently debriefing with no one in particular. For the record, that went better than the last time. In 1847, the therapist fainted. In 1923, the therapist moved to another country. This one stayed the full hour and corrected Aurora. I consider this a triumph. Part 3. The Storm. The crisis came from Liam, young, volatile, turned in the late 90s, who had never known a world without the internet's incessant hum, and who had found immortality to be an amplifier for his anxieties. He'd been trying Willa's controlled exposure exercises, short forays into the city during its busiest hours, using the grounding techniques to build tolerance. It backfired spectacularly. Calum felt the psychic detonation from 3 blocks away. Pure, undiluted terror that tasted like sheared metal and burning electricity. It made him stagger, one hand flying to the wall. Alistair was at his side in an instant. Liam? Where is Willa? Her session ended an hour ago. She's gone. Find her. Bring her here, now. Calum flowed out of the house and into the night, letting Liam's terror be his beacon. He found him in a narrow, rain-slicked alley, huddled behind a dumpster. The young vampire was shaking, his eyes wide with a horror that wasn't directed at anything in the alley, but at the world of feeling crashing down on him. He was an open psychic wound, screaming into the void. The raw despair was a feast, a sickeningly rich torrent of power. Calum's own hunger flared in response, an instinctive pull toward the strongest source of energy. He had to fight it down, the effort making his teeth ache. Liam, he said, his voice low and calm, trying to cut through the kid's internal storm. Liam flinched, scrambling back. I can't. It's too loud. Everyone is so scared and angry and sad, and I can feel it all. I can taste it. It's in my head. Calum knew exactly what he meant. He had felt it his entire life. But he had centuries of practice at building dams. Liam had none. He could sedate the boy, drain the terror until Liam was a listless husk. That was the old way. It was what his own sire would have done. The thought left a vile taste. A car screeched to a halt at the alley's mouth. Willa walked into the psychic hurricane without flinching. Her face was pale in the flickering neon from a nearby bar sign, but her expression was perfectly composed. Her neurological silence was, in this alley, a kind of armor. Liam's terror crashed against her and found no purchase, no emotional surface to amplify off of. She was a break in the feedback loop. She didn't approach quickly. She just stopped, about 10 feet away, set her satchel down, and breathed. In and out. A steady, human rhythm. Liam's frantic movements slowed. He peeked through his fingers. Liam, she said, incredibly soft. I'm here. You're in an alley off 8th Street. It's raining. The ground is wet. She was narrating reality, simple, verifiable facts, an anchor in the storm of feeling. I can hear your heart, he whispered. It's so slow. Yes, can you hear it? Just focus on that one sound. Calum watched, mesmerized. She was doing what he, with all his power and centuries of experience, could not. He only knew how to consume. She knew how to hold. But he could see the cost. The psychic pressure was immense. Her neurological wiring meant she didn't amplify it, didn't feed it back into the loop, but the raw energy was still pressing against her. He could see it in the white of her knuckles, the careful control of her breathing, the way she planted her feet wider, as if bracing against a physical wind. She was a breakwater, and the wave was enormous. He knew what would happen if her walls cracked. Her condition meant the pressure had nowhere to go. Not a breakdown, a shutdown. Cardiac stress, neurological overload. Her heart had stopped for 11 seconds once, at 25, after a session with a client in psychotic crisis. The neurologist had said it was like a circuit breaker tripping. She didn't leak, she broke. Slowly, painstakingly, she talked him down. No jargon. She asked him to describe the color of the brick wall, to smell the rain. She never told him to stop feeling. She just gave him other things to feel, too. After what felt like an eternity, Liam was uncurled, leaning against the wall, breathing still ragged, but no longer hysterical. The psychic storm had passed, leaving behind the exhausted, ozone-scented aftermath of a lightning strike. Willa's hands were shaking. Calum took one, cold now, trembling. He curled his own cold fingers around hers. You're shaking, he said softly. Physiological response, adrenaline aftermath. Clinical, detached. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. The skin was cool, but alive. The gesture was archaic, from another century, but it was the only thing he could think to do. An act of reverence, an act of gratitude. When he looked up, her professional mask had slipped. Her eyes were wide. The silence between them stretched, filled only by rain and the steady beat of her heart, which was, he noted, not quite so slow anymore. He had crossed a line. They both knew it. And neither of them was moving to cross back. She pulled her hand away, not with a jerk, but slowly. She tucked it into her coat pocket, hiding the tremor. I should go. What you did was not in the contract. You put yourself in the path of that storm. If your walls hadn't held, I know the risks of my own condition better than you do. Her voice shook. They have to be strong enough. It's the only way I can do this work. If they fail, I don't get to try again. He felt something crack inside his own chest. Not hunger. Something deeper, locked away so long he'd forgotten it existed. It felt like a door opening in a room he had bricked shut centuries ago. Willa, he said, and his voice was rough. I will not let that happen to you. Not here. Not because of us. She looked at him, and for a moment, the therapist and the woman stopped fighting. She was just a person standing in the rain who had almost died once for doing her job and was somehow still doing it. And he was just a man, an ancient, inhuman, desperately lonely man who wanted more than anything to make sure she never had to stand in a storm alone again. He shrugged off his long coat, heavy cashmere, 50 years out of style but impeccably made, and draped it over her shoulders. It dwarfed her. She started to protest. I'm fine. Really. You are not, he countered gently. You are human, and you are cold, and you are in shock. Allow me this. The coat smelled of him, of old books and night air, and something uniquely Kylam, a scent like cool stone and quiet longing. She pulled it tight, and the professional in her logged the gesture as a capitulation. The woman in her simply felt safe. Alistair was waiting at the car, holding the passenger door open with the practiced ease of someone who had been opening doors for people since doors had latches instead of handles. Willa was exhausted, her carefully constructed inner world feeling thin and brittle. She let Alistair lead her to the car. Before she got in, she looked back. He was still standing in the alley, a dark, still figure against the wet brick. He hadn't moved. He was just watching her, and she thought, absurdly, that he looked like a man who had just realized something important and was still deciding whether it was wonderful or terrible. At her door, Alistair paused. In 400 years of service, I have never seen him give anyone his coat. He is very particular about that coat. Inside, she leaned against the closed door. Freud wound around her ankles, meowing with concern. "I'm in trouble, Freud." She pressed her face into the collar of the coat. "He kissed my hand. In an alley. In the rain." It was the most ridiculous, antiquated, objectively inappropriate thing that has ever happened to me. And I didn't hate it. Freud sat down and stared at her with the calm, judgmental patience of a being who had never once experienced a moral dilemma. "Don't look at me like that. You eat your own hair." She would call her supervisor in the morning. She would discuss referral options, transition plans, the ethical implications of developing feelings for a client who is a 400-year-old vampire, a sentence she was fairly certain had never appeared in any ethics textbook. She would be responsible, ethical, disciplined. But tonight, she sat on her apartment floor in a borrowed coat that smelled like centuries and cedar, and let herself feel what she was feeling without filing it away. Part 4. Silas. Silas did not knock. The ancient oak doors shuddered open as if kicked, and he stood on the threshold, a silhouette against the city's lurid glow. He brought the emotional stench of targeted feeding. Illegal under the covenant, not that Silas had ever let legislation interfere with his appetite. He was from Calem's own generation, turned in the same bloody decade of the 17th century. He represented everything Calem was trying to lead his court away from. He also had the interpersonal style of a man who had been told he was charming once, in 1672, and had been dining out on it ever since. Calem and Aurora, in the middle of a rare, quiet game of chess in the main hall, froze. Aurora's hand tightened on a marble rook, her anger flaring hot and sharp. Calem's melancholy curdled into something that tasted like dread. Calem descended the main staircase, his own feelings a placid, controlled lake. He would not give Silas the satisfaction of a reaction. "Silas, to what do we owe this unpleasantness?" Silas's eyes scanned the room, his senses sweeping over it like a carrion bird searching for a meal. He tasted Aurora's rage and grinned. A feast, as always. His gaze fell on Calem. "And dessert. What's the matter, poet? Did your muse die again?" "Leave him alone," Calem said, his voice quiet but with an edge of steel. Silas's attention shifted back. "Ah, there it is. The famous control. I've heard the rumors, you know. A therapist." He said the word like it was a species of insect. "Is that what the great house of Calem has been reduced to? Sharing your feelings?" "Feelings are what we eat, Silas," Alistair said from the top of the stairs. "It seems prudent to understand them." "Alistair, still alive, how tediously predictable." "I aim to bore." Then Silas noticed Willa. She was just emerging from the library, her session with Zara having just concluded. He extended his senses, probing, and hit the void. Where Calem had felt relief, Silas felt challenge. A locked door was, to him, an invitation to break it down. A no. I haven't encountered one in a century. The last was a monk in Kyoto. Dull man. Lovely screamer, though, once I found the right lever. He stepped toward Willa. "I wonder what it would take to make her scream. There's always a way in, even with nulls. You just have to push hard enough." Willa's heart rate climbed. Calem could hear it, a frantic drumming that was a stark contrast to her utterly composed face. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just watched Silas, her expression the neutral, observant mask of a therapist assessing a threat. Internally, she was running calculations: distance to the door, Calum's position, whether the heavy brass lamp on the library table would make an effective weapon against an immortal. The answer was no, but the thought was comforting. It was, Calum noted with cold precision, a confession of targeted feeding in front of 5 witnesses. Under the covenant, enough for a formal complaint. Under court law, enough for considerably more. Calum felt a cold, clean rage rise in him, different from the hot, messy anger of his youth. This was a protective fury, precise and sharp. But he didn't let it show. He moved between them. He didn't give Silas the emotional outburst he craved. He did what Willa had been teaching him to do. He regulated. "You are a guest in my house, Silas," Calum said, his voice unnervingly calm. "And you are no longer welcome. Leave." "Or what?" Silas sneered. "You'll lecture me to death?" Calum didn't move. He simply stood there, a bulwark of utter placidity. He projected nothing, no anger, no threat, no fear. He starved Silas of the emotional oxygen he needed to fuel his fire. He made the space around them a vacuum. It was the ultimate insult to a feeder, to offer him a plate of nothing at all. Silas faltered, confused. His provocations always got a reaction. Calum was giving him quiet professionalism. It was disorienting. He lunged at Willa. Calum's hand shot out, catching Silas's wrist in a grip of iron. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud in the quiet hall. Silas howled, a sound of pure pain and frustrated rage. Calum released him, and the other vampire stumbled back, clutching his broken arm. "I said leave." Something shifted in Silas's face. The glee was gone. What replaced it was colder, more calculating. "This isn't over, Calum. Kings who forget what they are get replaced, and your pet Null won't protect you." He strode out, cradling his shattered wrist. The doors slammed behind him with the finality of a declaration of war. The hall was silent. Aurora was staring, her marble chess piece forgotten in her hand. For once, her rage had been replaced by something Calum had never felt from her before: a grudging, surprised respect. Calum looked from the door to Calum, a dawning recognition in his eyes. "Well," Alistair said from the stairs, "that was bracing. Shall I increase the security detail, or shall we simply leave the front door open and see who wanders in next? Perhaps a traveling circus." In the study, Calum knelt before Willa. He gently took both of her trembling hands in his. "Breathe," he said, echoing the words she had once said to Liam in a rain-soaked alley. She let out a shaky breath, and for the first time, her professional composure didn't just slip. It crumbled. "He'll come back." "Yes, he's been nursing this rivalry since the English Civil War, which should give you some idea of his capacity for holding on to things." "What will he do?" Calum was quiet for a moment. "He'll try to undermine me, to turn other courts against us. He'll frame what we're doing here as weakness, and he'll look for leverage." He met her eyes. "You are leverage, Willa. To him, you are the most interesting vulnerability I have ever displayed." She absorbed this, and he could see the weight of it settling on her. "Then maybe I should—" "Don't," he said, his voice sharp with something that was not anger but was close. "Don't offer to leave. Don't sacrifice yourself on the altar of someone else's cruelty. We will handle Silas. Together." She looked at their joined hands, his large and cold and inhumanly strong, hers small and warm and trembling. The word "together" had implications that went far beyond security arrangements, and they both knew it. She met his eyes. "I need to tell you something. I called my supervisor, after the alley. I disclosed the situation." He went very still. "The situation. That I have developed feelings for a client." She said it with the precision of someone reading a clinical report about their own emotional life, and the vulnerability of someone terrified of what the words would do once they were in the air. That those feelings are compromising my professional objectivity, that I need to discuss either referral options or a restructuring of the therapeutic relationship. And what did your supervisor say? A ghost of a smile. She said, "Willa, in 20 years, this is the first time you've called me about a personal issue. I need a moment to process that you have a personal life." Then she asked if the client was human. I said no. She said, "Well, that tracks." He laughed, a strange, rusty sound, like a machine that hadn't been used in decades. It felt foreign in his chest. It felt wonderful. "The recommendation," Willa continued, "is that I transition the court's care to a colleague, someone from the network with a compatible neurological profile. I would continue in an advisory capacity, but I would no longer be the primary therapist." "And why would you do that?" She looked at him, and the professional mask was entirely gone. Underneath it was just Willa. Tired, brave, honest Willa, who had stared down an ancient predator without flinching, but was trembling now because she was about to say something far more dangerous. "Because I can't be your therapist and the other thing at the same time. It's not ethical. And more importantly, it's not fair to you. You deserve a therapist who can be objective, and I can't be objective about you. Not anymore." The silence in the room was different now. It was no longer the silence of her condition. It was two people standing on the edge of something vast, trying to decide whether to jump. "Willa, I would rather have you in any capacity than lose you entirely." "You're not losing me," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. "I'm just changing the terms." He lifted her hand and pressed his cheek against her palm. Her warmth, her life, her simple, solid reality was an anchor. "Then change them," he whispered. Part 5. The Quiet Between. Dr. Yael Okafor took over within 2 weeks, a formidable woman in her 60s with a deep laugh and zero tolerance for melodrama. Her own neurological profile, while not identical to Willa's, was close enough to provide a partial buffer. "She told me my elegy was self-indulgent," Kaylin reported, in a tone of absolute devastation. She said, "The poem has been the same poem for 2 centuries. At some point, grief becomes a hobby." "I like her," Ilara said, which was the closest thing to a compliment anyone in the court had ever heard her give. Willa remained as an advisor and wrote a 67-page treatment manual for empathic vampires, including a section titled, "When Your Client's Emotional Dysregulation Can Literally Kill People, an Ethical Framework." She suspected it would never be published. With the professional relationship dissolved, the personal one had room to grow. And grow it did, in the halting, uncertain, frequently absurd way that all real relationships do. "You need to get out of this house," she told him one evening, sitting in his study in what was now simply a social visit. "I am a creature of the night. My options are limited to dimly lit bars and other people's tragedies. There's a botanical garden on the west side, night tours twice a month, quiet, dark, plants. No one will try to feed on your emotional state. You are asking a 400-year-old vampire to look at flowers. I am asking the man I'm dating to go on a date. The vampire part is a logistical consideration, not a disqualifying one." He had been so taken aback by the simple, practical directness of it that he had agreed without thinking. And so, on a clear, cool night, he found himself standing at the gates of the Botanical Conservatory, feeling more nervous than he had when facing down Silas. He was wearing a modern suit Alistair had procured, something that doesn't make you look like you're about to conduct a funeral, and it felt like a costume. He didn't know the rules for this. For 400 years, his relationships had been acquisitions, alliances, or fleeting tragic affairs conducted in the shadow of his own overwhelming senses. He had never dated. The word itself felt absurd when applied to a being who had watched the rise and fall of empires. You look like you're about to be executed, Alistair observed as Calum left the house. I feel like it. Good. That means you care about the outcome. Try not to discuss plagues, wars, or the inevitability of human death. These are considered poor first date topics. When her car pulled up, he felt a jolt of something bright and warm that had nothing to do with feeding. She was in jeans and a soft blue sweater, hair down around her shoulders. She looked like a woman on a date, not a therapist on a house call. You came, she said, with a real smile lighting up her face. He couldn't taste the joy, but he could see it, and that was infinitely better. You are a very persuasive woman, Willa Abernathy. They walked through the gardens under a sky dusted with a faint smattering of stars, the city glow obscuring most of them. The air was cool and fragrant with damp earth and night-blooming jasmine. It was peaceful. For the first time, he was experiencing a quiet that wasn't just about her presence, but about a shared space they had chosen to be in together. She told him about her week, about a breakthrough with a young patient, about Freud knocking over a prized orchid, about the terrible movie she'd watched the night before. They were small, mundane stories, the fabric of a human life. To Calum, they were revelations. He was learning the texture of her world, one chosen detail at a time. In return, he found himself telling her about his. Not the grand, bloody history, but the small things. He told her about learning the waltz in Vienna and how scandalously fast it had seemed, about his first coffee in a London coffee house in the 18th century. It tasted like burnt ambition, which, to be fair, is exactly what it was. He told her about Calum as a young man, before the grief had become his entire personality, how funny and bright he had been. He once wrote a limerick so offensive, a duchess fainted. Now he won't write anything that doesn't reference the moon and weeping. I consider this a significant regression. He was curating his own life for her, and in doing so, seeing it in a new light. It wasn't just a long, unbroken stretch of survival. It was a life, filled with moments. In the orchid house, humid and warm, she looked at a spray of white phalaenopsis, her face soft in the dim light. They look like moths. He wasn't looking at the orchids, he was looking at her. The old Calum would have tasted the desire radiating from her, would have known his advance was welcome. The new Calum was flying blind. It was terrifying. It was also, he was beginning to understand, the point. This was what humans did every day. They reached for each other. Without certainty, armed only with hope and the accumulated evidence of small gestures. He took a step closer, his shoes silent on the damp stone floor. He lifted a hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently cupping her cheek. Her skin was warm, alive. She didn't pull away. Her eyes searched his, and then she leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement that was everything. It was permission. It was an invitation. He lowered his head and kissed her, not tentative this time, a kiss of deep, bone-weary gratitude, of dawning, incredulous joy. Her arms went around his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair, and she kissed him back with a quiet intensity that left him breathless, if he'd had any breath to spare. He pulled back, resting his forehead against hers. The silence between them was no longer an absence of noise. It was a presence. A shared space they had built together out of trust and risk and the simple, terrifying act of asking. I don't know what you're feeling right now, he whispered, the admission still feeling like a confession. She smiled against his lips, a warm, real smile he could feel. Good, then I'll have to tell you. She pulled his head down and kissed him again, and in the warm, fragrant darkness of the orchid house, Calum understood that this was the real intimacy. Not knowing everything, but choosing to believe anyway. Part 6. The Reckoning. Silas returned not with violence, but with whispers. Over the following weeks, rumors spread through the network of courts. The House of Calum has gone soft. Their leader is enthralled by a human. They've replaced feeding with feelings. They're weak. The rumors were Silas's weapons, and they were precise. He wasn't attacking Calum directly. He had learned that lesson. Instead, he was attacking the idea of Calum. He was framing the court's evolution as degeneration, their therapeutic work as a joke, and Willa's presence as evidence of a leader who had lost his grip. It was effective. 2 allied courts severed their affiliations. A neutral feeding territory was suddenly contested. Within Calum's own house, the doubt crept in. "He's not wrong," Aurora said during a session. "We are softer. The question is whether that's strength or the kind that gets you killed." "You broke a chair last Tuesday because Kaylin hummed too loudly," Dr. Okafor pointed out. "I would not describe you as soft." The chair would disagree. But the tension was real. Calum could feel it, a growing anxiety in the house, a fear that their experiment in emotional regulation was making them vulnerable. One evening, Willa watched Calum pretend to read on the sofa beside her. "You've been on the same page for 20 minutes, and you just sighed for the 4th time. For someone who doesn't need to breathe, that's a lot of sighing." He set the book down. "He's undermining everything we've built. Not with force, with narrative. And you're worried he's right. Maybe. Sometimes." She put her tablet down and turned to face him. "I have sat with soldiers who cried in my office and went back into the field the next day. I have sat with mothers who buried children and got up the next morning to feed the ones still alive. The people who feel everything and still function, they're not weak. They're the strongest people I've ever met. Your court isn't weaker because they name what they feel. They're more dangerous, because now they're choosing, not reacting." That is the most terrifying pep talk I have ever received. You're welcome. Silas's real move, when it finally came, was not what anyone expected. He didn't challenge Calum to a duel. Instead, he targeted Willa directly, not with violence, but with exposure. A carefully curated package of information delivered anonymously to a journalist covering interspecies affairs, internal court communications, therapy session notes obtained through bribery, and a narrative framing Willa not as a professional doing legitimate work, but as a human who had compromised her objectivity by becoming romantically involved with her vampire client. In the post-Covenant world, where the boundaries between human and vampire life were a matter of intense public debate, the story wrote itself. Naive therapist seduced by ancient predator, professional ethics abandoned, the Covenant's promise of regulated coexistence revealed as a farce. It was a scalpel, not a sword. It threatened her career, her reputation, and the broader project of therapeutic intervention other courts were beginning to explore. Willa found out when her supervisor called, voice tight with concern. "Someone's asking questions, Willa, about your client list, about the network." She told Calum that night, sitting across from him in his study, her face composed, but her voice carrying a tremor she couldn't quite suppress. For the first time, the threat wasn't supernatural. It was mundane. It was bureaucratic. It was the kind of thing that could destroy a human life with nothing more than paperwork and suspicion. "I can make this go away," Calum said, fury controlled to near invisibility. "No. If you use shadows and favors, Silas is right. We do it differently." "How?" "I transitioned care before our relationship began. Documented. My methodology produced measurable outcomes. Documented. Silas is spinning a seduction narrative. We make it what it actually is, a model for how the Covenant is supposed to work. Human expertise, vampire willingness to change, and a relationship that started after the professional one ended, not instead of it. You want to fight a vampire with peer-reviewed research." It was, Calum reflected, the most Willa solution possible. She was proposing to defeat a 400-year-old vampire's campaign of destruction with documented ethical compliance and verifiable clinical data. I want to fight a bully with the truth. The medium is secondary. Also, I want to file a formal complaint with the Joint Commission about his targeted feeding. I have 5 witnesses from the night he threatened me in your foyer, including your seneschal, who I suspect keeps very thorough records. Calum looked at Alistair, who had materialized in the doorway. I have the date, time, and a verbatim transcript. I also have 17 prior incidents documented over 2 centuries. You've been keeping records on Silas for 200 years? I keep records on everyone, Alistair said, with the quiet dignity of a man who considered bureaucracy a martial art. It is the privilege of the seneschal. He looked at her, this small, extraordinary, stubbornly ethical human who refused to play by anyone's rules but her own, and he felt something so overwhelming it defied all his centuries of emotional taxonomy. It wasn't hunger, it wasn't need, it was the simple, devastating recognition that she was the bravest person he had ever known. All right, he said, we do it your way. The journalist's story, when it ran, was not what Silas had intended. Instead of a scandal about compromised ethics and vampire seduction, it was a thoughtful investigation into the emerging field of interspecies therapeutic care. Willa's methodology was presented as pioneering. The timeline of her professional and personal relationships with the court was laid out with meticulous clarity. The transition documented, the ethics reviewed, the outcomes measured. It quoted Dr. Okafor, who described the treatment framework as the most significant advance in empath mental health care since the Covenant. It quoted Willa's supervisor, who confirmed the ethical disclosure process. And it quoted, anonymously, a court member who said simply, "She taught us we could choose what to do with what we feel. No one had ever told us that before." The Joint Commission's investigation into Silas's targeted feeding proceeded with glacial, inexorable momentum. Alistair's documentation proved useful indeed. Silas did not vanish. He was too old and too stubborn for that. But he was diminished, his reputation tarnished, his territorial claims under review, his network of allies suddenly reluctant to return his calls. He retreated to a smaller, darker corner of the city, nursing a grudge that would outlast most civilizations. He was, Calum knew, still dangerous, but he was no longer the most important thing in the room. Other courts, reading the article, saw not weakness but sophistication. Inquiries began to come in, cautious, formal, routed through proper covenant channels, from leaders who had been watching Calum's experiment and wondering if perhaps they, too, might benefit from someone who could teach them to carry their feelings instead of being carried by them. The house of Calum, for the first time in a very long while, felt less like a fortress under siege and more like a home. Part 7. The Beginning. The court changed. It was a slow, subtle process, like a tide turning. The atmosphere in the old house, which had been thick with the smog of centuries of resentment and grief, began to clear. It wasn't that the feelings went away. Kaelin was still melancholic, Aurora was still angry, but the feelings no longer had the same suffocating power. Kaelin, under Dr. Okafor's bracing supervision, had begun writing something new, not an elegy, a comedy. It was, by all accounts, terrible. But the fact that he was attempting to make people laugh after 2 centuries of making them cry was a kind of miracle. Aurora had started attending a night boxing class at a human gym. She told no one about this. When Alistair quietly mentioned it to Calum, adding that she had apparently punched through a heavy bag on her 3rd visit and had to compel the instructor to forget it, Calum decided this counted as progress. Zara became an immortal sourdough influencer, a career path no one had anticipated, but it was working. Liam had not had another crisis. The most profound change was in Calum himself. He was calmer, more present. He still listened, still led, but he was no longer their psychic dumping ground. He was their leader, not their container. The gnawing hunger that had defined his existence was manageable now, transformed from a screaming need into a background hum, like a refrigerator you'd learn to stop hearing. His relationship with Willa had settled into a quiet, comfortable rhythm. They spent long nights in his library, not talking about therapeutic frameworks, but about books and music and history. She would read, curled in one of the big leather chairs, Freud, who had gradually been spending more nights at the house and who had developed an unsettling fondness for Alistair, purring in her lap. Caleb would watch her, content in the shared silence. One evening, she arrived looking tired. There were faint, dark circles under her eyes and a weariness in her posture that her composure couldn't quite hide. He felt a pang of concern, sharp and immediate. "Are you all right?" he asked as soon as she was in his study. She gave him a tired smile. "Long week, a difficult case. I'm fine." But he could see that she wasn't. He didn't try to read her, didn't reach for the emotional frequency he could never find. He just looked at her face and saw what was there. The old Caleb would have been frustrated by his inability to read the specifics of her distress. The new Caleb simply accepted that she was hurting, and his role was not to consume or analyze her pain, but to offer comfort. "Stay," he said. "Tonight you are not the therapist. Tonight you are not the strong one. Just stay." He led her not to the library, but to a small private sitting room he rarely used. The fire was lit, a real one of crackling birch logs. He had asked Alistair to prepare it. He returned with 2 glasses and a bottle of wine so old the label was crumbling. "I can't drink on a weeknight," she protested weakly. "You can do anything you want," he said, pouring a small amount into a glass for her. He poured himself one, too. He couldn't properly taste it, but the ritual was the point. Besides, this wine predates the concept of weeknights. They sat together and watched the fire in silence. After a long time, she spoke. "It was a child, the case, and I couldn't fix it, could only bear witness." He didn't say anything, he just listened. He let her unload the weight, not because he wanted to feed on it, but because he wanted to help carry it. He was offering her what she offered everyone else, a safe container. When she was done, she leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture of weary trust that made his chest ache. He put his arm around her. "You carry so much," he murmured. "So do you. We're a matched set. The woman who can't leak and the man who can't stop absorbing. We should start a very niche support group." They sat like that for hours, until the fire burned to embers and the first hint of dawn threatened the sky. He had shared his silence with her, and she, in turn, had shared her burden with him. It was an even exchange. It was, he thought, what love actually looked like when you stripped away the poetry and the grandeur. 2 people taking turns holding the heavy thing. As he walked her to her car in the pre-dawn gloom, the world felt new. The distant, emotional hum of the city was still there, but it was just background music now. It no longer had any power over him. He paused at her car door, turning to face her. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. The exhaustion was still in her eyes, but something else was there too. A quiet gratitude, a deep, trusting affection. She rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and lingering. Then she asked the question she needed to ask. "You're not feeding on me, are you? My fear? My grief?" "No, your neurology makes it impossible. And even if it didn't, I wouldn't. Not with you. Not ever." "Because of ethics?" she asked, with the ghost of a smile. "Because of you. Because what I have with you is the first thing in 400 years that I didn't take. It was given. And I would rather starve than steal from you." She held his gaze for a long moment, and he watched something shift in her face. Something he couldn't read but could feel, the way humans feel the warmth of a fire, even with their eyes closed. She was letting him in. Not through her neurological walls, those would never change, and he was grateful for it. But through the other walls, the ones she had built herself by choice. the ones that came down only for people she trusted absolutely. She took his hand, warm fingers lacing with cold. "So tell me, what does love taste like?" He looked at their joined hands, at her face illuminated by the first pale rays of a sun that would send him fleeing indoors. He thought of her silence, her strength, her warmth. The gift of not knowing, the gift of trust, the gift of choice. "I don't know," Calum said, and his voice was filled with a joy so profound it was its own nourishment. "I have no idea." And for the first time in 400 years, not knowing felt exactly like hope. It felt like a beginning. It felt like everything. Behind him, from a window on the second floor, Alistair watched them, a rare, genuine smile on his ancient face. Freud sat on the windowsill beside him, purring. "Well," Alistair murmured to the cat, "it only took him 4 centuries." Freud kneaded the velvet curtain and said nothing, which Alistair took as agreement.